I ruined my husband's dreams. Selfishly, now I'm replaced and I'm alone. If I could go back in time, I would, without a doubt. If I could confront the version of myself that ruined everything, I would beg her to think better about her decisions, but I can't. And now all I have left is to tell my story. My name is Luna, and this is the confession of how my selfishness destroyed the dreams of my husband, the man who loved me most in life, and how he moved on without me. I never thought Eduardo could leave me. I always believed that no matter what happened, we would stay together, but I was wrong. Because when someone truly loves you, when they give you their trust, when they allow you to be a part of their dreams, and you trample all over it without thinking about the consequences, that person gets tired. And Eduardo got tired of me. Now I see him from afar, living the life he always wanted with the woman I never knew how to be. And me? I only have my regrets. But to understand how I got here, I have to tell you how it all began. I met Eduardo at university. He studied medicine, I studied literature. We were completely different, but somehow we fit together perfectly. Eduardo had a clear dream: to become a renowned surgeon and help people in the most difficult cases. From the moment I met him, I knew he wasn't like the others. He didn't drink himself into oblivion at parties. He wasn't distracted by unimportant things. While others complained about exams and long nights of studying, Eduardo simply smiled and said, "This is what I want to do with my life." And I admired him. Our relationship started simply. We met in the university cafeteria when I accidentally took his coffee, thinking it was mine. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, but instead of getting angry, he laughed. If you needed caffeine, you only had to ask. I blushed, I wanted to disappear. That was our first encounter. And from there, little by little, we grew closer. We spent hours talking about everything. I loved listening to him describe his studies with such passion, and he, in turn, seemed captivated by the way I saw the world through words. We fell in love without realizing it. And when we graduated, we got married. It was the best decision of my life, and also the worst, because I didn't know how to live up to what love truly meant. The first years of marriage with Eduardo were good, not perfect, but good. We lived in a small apartment in the city, near the hospital where Eduardo was doing his residency. I had gotten a job as an editor at a publishing house, something I liked, but not as passionate about as medicine was for him. That was the key point in our relationship. Eduardo lived for his dream. Everything he did revolved around his career, his desire to be the best. It didn't matter how many hours of sleep he lost, the meals he skipped, or the times he had to cancel plans with me. For him, saving lives was the most important thing. First, I understood. I saw him arrive exhausted after a 16-hour shift, with dark circles and a heavy gait, but with his eyes shining because he had learned something new. He told me every detail of his surgeries, of the cases that impressed him, of the doctors he admired. I smiled, hugged him, and told him I was proud of him. But little by little, I began to feel displaced. It was as if I was in the background, as if Eduardo was married to his career instead of being married to me. The nights he arrived late became more frequent. The dinners we planned turned into cold plates waiting for him alone at the table. Conversations were reduced to me asking him how his day was and him responding with monosyllables because he was too tired to talk. I tried not to complain. I knew his career was difficult, that he needed my support. But inside, something stirred with resentment. What happened to the Eduardo who was excited to see me? The Eduardo who dedicated time to me without me having to ask for it? And the worst part was that I hated myself for feeling this way, because I knew Eduardo wasn't doing anything with bad intentions. He didn't ignore me because he didn't love me anymore, but because he was fighting for his future, for the future we had planned together. But feelings aren't always logical, and resentment, when left to grow, becomes something dangerous. As the years passed, the distance between us became more evident. I truly loved him, but I couldn't help but feel that I occupied a smaller and smaller space in his life. Insecurity settled in my head. What if Eduardo realized that I wasn't enough? What if, in his world of brilliant doctors and intelligent, ambitious women, he found someone better than me? I wasn't part of his world. While he was in the hospital dealing with life or death decisions, I was in my office correcting grammatical errors in manuscripts that probably no one would read. I looked at myself in the mirror and asked myself, does Eduardo really need me? Or am I just still here because it's the most comfortable thing? The worst part is that I had no one to talk to about this. My friends told me it was normal for a marriage to change over time, that Eduardo was still a good man. And they were right. The problem wasn't him, it was me. But instead of facing my insecurities, I let them grow. You see, from the first day at university, I knew he wasn't like the other medical students. He wasn't one of those who study just to pass. He wanted to understand everything, to be the best at what he did, not out of ego, but because he knew that someday his knowledge would mean the difference between life and death for someone. When he began his residency, he worked endless hours, doing 24-hour shifts at the hospital, sleeping on uncomfortable chairs, living off coffee and protein bars. But he never complained, never said, "I'm tired" or "I can't anymore." On the contrary, every day he came home with new stories, with an excitement in his voice that showed how much he loved what he did. He told me about the patients he had treated, about the difficult diagnoses he had managed to solve, about the surgeries he witnessed, with eyes shining with emotion. I listened to him, sometimes with genuine interest, other times pretending that it didn't bother me that his work had become his priority. Because while Eduardo was living his dream, I felt mine fading. Not because he prevented me, but because I myself didn't know what to do with my life. I saw his passion and asked myself, and what is my purpose? But instead of looking for an answer, I let envy and insecurity grow inside me. And when Eduardo received the opportunity of a lifetime, instead of supporting him, I did the unforgivable. The day Eduardo received the news, I should have been happy for him. I should have hugged him, kissed him, and celebrated like the wife I once promised to be. But instead I felt a knot in my stomach. It was an afternoon like any other. I was in the living room reviewing a boring manuscript when Eduardo came through the door with a different expression. His usual tiredness was still there, but there was something else. His eyes shone with contained excitement. "Luna," he said, unable to hide his enthusiasm. I put the manuscript aside and looked at him. Eduardo took a deep breath before continuing. "They've offered me a position at one of the best hospitals in the country. It's a specialization in trauma surgery. They only choose 3 doctors each year, and they chose me." I looked at him, processing each word. "That's incredible," I said, forcing myself to smile. "It is," he agreed. "It's a 2-year program. I would learn from the best, work with high-impact cases. It would be a big step for my career." 2 years. That detail stuck in my chest like a thorn. "Where is it?" I asked, fearing the answer. "In another state," he said cautiously. "But we can talk about it. I don't want to make any decisions without you." I nodded slowly, even though my head was spinning. If Eduardo left, what would happen to us? What would happen to me? This was the life we had built together, with plans, dreams, and promises. And now he was going to leave it all behind? I knew he wasn't doing it with bad intentions. Eduardo had never been selfish. He had always put his career first, yes, but in his mind everything he did was for us. But I didn't see it that way. I saw his job offer as a test that in the end his world and mine were too different. Because while he had a clear path, a defined purpose, I only existed in the shadows of his life, with nothing to make me shine on my own. If Eduardo left, what if he discovered that he could live without me? What if he met someone who shared his passion, someone who understood him better than I did? I couldn't allow it. I couldn't lose him. And so, in the midst of my fear and selfishness, I made the worst decision of my life. I still remember the exact moment I made the decision. It wasn't an impulsive outburst. It wasn't a momentary mistake that I would later regret. It was something I planned calmly, with every thought wrapped in the selfishness of my fear. I told myself that I was doing it for our marriage, that I was doing it because Eduardo and I should be together, because our relationship wouldn't survive the distance, because if he left I would lose him forever. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want Eduardo to leave. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want him to grow while I remained stagnant. So when he left early that morning for his shift at the hospital, I knew it was time. I waited to hear the sound of the door closing behind him. I waited a few more minutes to make sure he hadn't forgotten something and would come back unexpectedly. When everything was silent, I got up from the sofa and walked over to his desk. My hands were shaking, not because of guilt, not yet. It was adrenaline, the fear of being discovered. Eduardo wasn't one to leave his computer without a password, but I knew it. He trusted me. I had entered it many times when he asked me to review a document or download something for him while he was showering. His passwords were always variations of the same dates. Our wedding, the birth of his sister, the day we adopted our first cat. I entered it easily. The screen lit up before me with my heart pounding in my throat. I searched for the important messages folder where Eduardo kept all the information related to his work. There it was, the email from the selection committee of the hospital that had chosen him. I opened it and read every word with my stomach clenched. Dear Dr. Eduardo Ramirez, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to participate in our specialization program in trauma surgery. I imagined him reading it for the first time, feeling the excitement running through his body, the validation of years of sacrifice and effort. And in that instant, something inside me screamed to stop, to not do it, that closing the computer and facing reality would be difficult, yes, but that I could still choose the right path. I closed my eyes and clenched my fists. My heart and mind waged a silent battle, but the insecurity was stronger. The fear was stronger. I opened a new message. My fingers moved over the keyboard with a coldness that terrified me. Dear sirs, I deeply appreciate the opportunity you have offered me, but after careful reflection, I have decided to decline the offer for personal reasons. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Dr. Eduardo Ramirez. I read and reread the message, corrected it, polished it as Eduardo would do. When I was satisfied, I moved the cursor to the send button. My fingers stopped. In that moment, guilt wanted to surface. Don't do this, you can still close everything and pretend you never tried. But another voice inside me, the most selfish, the most terrifying, whispered calmly, if he leaves, he'll leave you behind, and you know it. I clicked. The email disappeared into the abyss of the internet, taking Eduardo's dreams with it. I felt immediate nausea. For a few seconds I stared at the blank screen, as if the universe was giving me a chance to repent. But it was too late. There was no turning back. I got up, closed the computer, and left it exactly as I had found it. I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were glassy, my skin pale. Everything's fine, I repeated to myself. No one will know. Eduardo will never find out. Life will go on as usual. But deep down I knew that something inside me had just broken forever, and that sooner or later, the truth would come to light. The day Eduardo received the hospital's response, I knew something inside him had died. I already knew, of course. I knew that the fake letter I sent had condemned him to stay, that I had silently murdered his chance to achieve everything he had worked for. But he didn't know. He believed the decision had been his, and that was the worst part. When he came home that afternoon, I knew something wasn't right even before he said a word. Eduardo usually had a routine when he came back from the hospital. Even if he was exhausted, he always gave me a kiss on the forehead, hugged me for a few seconds, and told me a quick anecdote from his day, something brief, almost automatic, but always there. That day there was no kiss, no hug. He didn't even look up when he closed the door behind him. He dropped his bag on the sofa and stood in the middle of the living room with tense shoulders, staring at the floor. I felt my throat tighten. I knew what was coming. Eduardo, I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer me immediately. Several seconds passed in which the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then he sighed, ran a hand over his face, and dropped his phone on the table. I turned down the offer, he said. He said it softly, as if he still couldn't believe it, as if he didn't even understand why he had done it. I forced myself to feign surprise. What? How? He shook his head. I don't know, he replied in a whisper. I don't know. He sat on the sofa, his eyes vacant. I took his phone with trembling hands and opened his email. There it was, his letter, the letter I had written in his name. My stomach twisted. I read the message as if it were the first time I saw it, as if I weren't the cause of all this. Eduardo, are you sure it was you who sent this? I asked, hoping his mind would fill with doubts, that somehow the truth would remain buried. But he just nodded slowly. Yes, I think so. He frowned. I don't remember writing it. My heart was racing. For a moment I felt fear that he would discover the truth. But his mind was elsewhere. He leaned forward, rubbing his face with both hands. Or maybe it was the stress. Maybe deep down I didn't want to go, he whispered. And there I saw it. The doubt, the suffering, the beginning of his depression. Eduardo was a strong man. He had faced grueling shifts, the pressure of saving lives, the weight of a career that demanded constant sacrifices. But this was different. This wasn't a difficulty he could overcome with effort. This was the collapse of everything he had built. And the worst part was that he didn't know why he felt this way. He couldn't understand his own pain because in his mind, he had sabotaged himself. He remained silent for the rest of the night. He barely touched his dinner. He didn't watch TV, didn't read a book, didn't check his phone. He just sat in silence, staring into nothingness. I wanted to cry. I wanted to confess everything, but I didn't. Instead, I went to him and knelt beside him. He just looked at me with such deep sadness that I felt like I couldn't breathe. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Luna," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know why I feel this way." My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I hugged him tightly, resting my head on his chest, and I felt his ragged breathing, the way his body tensed, the way his soul broke in my arms. I hugged him because I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't tell him the truth. I could only hold him while he sank into despair. I hid the truth for as long as I could, but guilt is a parasite. It clings to the skin, to the soul, to every corner of the mind. It feeds on silences, on lies, on averted gazes. And sooner or later, it grows so much that it cannot be ignored. For weeks I watched Eduardo fade before my eyes. He was no longer the passionate man who dreamed of saving lives. He no longer had that unstoppable energy that made him shine. He became someone who dragged his feet when he walked, who spoke in a dull voice, who smiled less and less. He made an effort to move on, but something inside him was broken, and I knew it was my fault. I tried to compensate him in many ways. I prepared his favorite meals, hugged him more than usual, told him how much I loved him, hoping that would alleviate the weight in my chest. But nothing worked because the problem wasn't him, it was me. Until one night, while we were in bed in the dark, I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. Eduardo was breathing slowly beside me, his eyes open, unable to sleep. Then I knew. No matter how hard I tried to pretend that everything was fine, he would never be the same again. "Eduardo, I have to tell you something." He turned to me, confused. My heart was beating so hard I felt like it was going to collapse. I sat up in bed, trembling, and took several deep breaths before I could speak. "It was me." He frowned. "What?" I swallowed. There was no turning back. "It was me who sent the rejection letter." His expression changed in an instant. His confusion turned into disbelief, then into horror. "No," he whispered, as if refusing to believe it. But I nodded, my eyes filled with tears. "I wrote it. I sent it. You never turned down the job. Eduardo, it was me." The silence that fell over the room was unbearable. He just stared at me, as if he couldn't process what he had just heard. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. I sobbed. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that you would leave, that you would leave me behind, that you would find something better than me." "That wasn't your decision," he shouted, and his voice had never sounded so broken, so full of pain. He got out of bed abruptly, running his hands through his hair in a desperate gesture. I knelt on the floor, crying. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Eduardo. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid." His voice trembled. "I would never have left you. Everything I did, everything I dreamed of, I did with you in mind. You were part of my life, of my future." My crying intensified. "I didn't want to lose you, Eduardo." He laughed bitterly, a laugh without joy. "Well, you did, Luna. You lost me." His words were a knife straight to my chest. He was silent for a few seconds, his gaze lost, as if he were realizing what it really meant, what he had just discovered. Then he nodded slowly, with an infinite sadness reflected in his eyes. "I can't do this. Eduardo, please no." He cut me off firmly. "There's no turning back. This isn't a small mistake. It's not something I can forgive. You took everything from me, Luna. You took my opportunity, my dream. And worst of all," he looked at me with a broken heart, "you took away the trust one had in you." There I knew that everything was over. The divorce was quick. There were no shouts or fights over possessions. Eduardo just wanted to get away from me as soon as possible. He packed his things and left without looking back. The last time I saw him was the day we signed the papers, and his expression was that of a man who had learned a lesson too expensive. No matter how much you love someone, if that person destroys who you are, you have to let them go. Months passed, and I learned that Eduardo finally accepted another job offer at another hospital, this time in another country. And as if fate wanted to punish me even more, I also learned that he found someone else. A doctor. A brilliant, passionate woman who shared his dreams. A woman who would never have made the mistakes I made. And me? I was left alone with the weight of my selfishness, with the guilt devouring me inside. I ruined my husband's dreams for fear of losing him, and in the end I lost him anyway. That was my punishment and I deserved it.